And with this, I want to say hello to everyone to this, autumn, the first autumn early career scientist seminar, the IGS seminar series. To quickly introduce myself, I'm Falk Warszewski, and I take over the coordination of the early career scientist talks. And I just say this because I want to thank Rebecca Schlegel, who has done this job for the past 2 years. And I think she did a really great job doing it. So want to thank her first, and then introduce our first speaker, who is Sonja Wahl. And Sonja Wahl has done her PhD in Norway at the University of Bergen, and she finished it in February this year. And she will be presenting the work of her PhD that deals with the formation and therefore the interpretation of stable water isotopes in isotope records in ice cores. And her work is based on observational measurements from the Greenland ice sheet at ESCRIP. And soon she will start a postdoc at Lausanne. And with this,
I hope. Okay, thanks, Falk. And I hope everyone can see my slides and hear me talk. So as Falk just mentioned, I will take you without further ado to the Greenland ice sheet, to a place that is called ESCRIP that you can see here on the map. And at ESCRIP, they are currently drilling an ice core. And ice cores, they are very valuable for paleoclimate research because they contain different climate proxy records that can be interpreted as a climate record. And so now I need to see if this works. Actually, yes. And here you can see such a record. This is a stable water isotope record, also from the Greenland ice sheet, but it's from a different ice core. And you can see here 120,000 years of stable water isotopes, basically. And you can see here on the left side, the current Holocene warm period, and on the right side, the last warm period. And in the middle here, you can see the glacial. And you also see that there's quite a lot of variability in the glacial. And now, of course, this is just a stable water isotope record. And now the question is how to translate this into a temperature or climate record. And for this, we need to know about the transfer function between the climate signal and the signal we later measure or analyze in the ice core. And for stable water isotopes in particular, it's very common knowledge that the precipitation input signal, so the snowfall that brings in the stable water isotopes, is a big part of the transfer function. But the question is if this is really the only governing parameter that of this transfer function between climate and ice core signal. And the question of my research project, or the research question for this bigger project that is called SNOW-ESO that I am part of, is exactly this. If other surface processes are part of this transfer function, so basically all the processes that go on the surface while the snow is being in contact with the atmosphere. So after the precipitation event and before the snow gets buried with the next snowfall event. And in particular, my task was to investigate the vapor exchange, so the humidity exchange between the snow surface and the atmosphere through sublimation and deposition, and analyze whether this contributes to the signal that we find in the snow surface. And before we now dive into the actual research that I've done, I need to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding stable water isotopes, and therefore need to introduce the basic principle of any kind of stable water isotope research. And this is isotopic fractionation. So just as a very brief summary, a water body, whatever phase it is in, has a certain isotopic composition. And this means the ratio between heavy water molecules and light water molecules. This is called the isotopic ratio and is given as this delta value that you probably are familiar with. And now during any phase change process, for example, evaporation, there's relatively more light water molecules that is being evaporated in that case. And therefore the isotopic composition of both the evaporate and also the gases phase is changing. So because there's relatively more light water molecules being evaporated. So this means now after the evaporation process, our liquid water is enriched in heavy water molecules, and the gases phase is relatively depleted in heavy water molecules. This is called isotopic fractionation, and this is also temperature dependent, which is the basis for why we can use stable water isotope ratios as a temperature proxy, basically. So now I have explained this as with the evaporation process, but of course on the Greenland ice sheet, we don't have evaporation, but the snow sublimates. So it goes from the solid state into the gaseous phase. And the question is whether this happens as a layer by layer removal of snow crystals and therefore doesn't involve isotopic fractionation, or if sublimation actually includes isotopic fractionation and therefore has the potential to actually change the snow isotopic composition, which is the basis for what we later measure in the ice core. And this was basically my first research question that I wanted to answer. And for this, I went to the Greenland ice sheet and just wanted to measure the sublimation flux and its isotopic composition directly with field observations. So here we have used this eddy covariance measure device to measure the humidity flux, so the sublimation flux. And at the same time, we measured the vapor isotopic composition using laser spectroscopy to then get the sublimation flux isotopic composition. And the results you can see in this summary plot here. We plotted all the isotopic composition of the sublimation flux and of all our observations on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, you see the snow isotopic composition. And first of all, you can see that there's a very strong correlation between these two parameters, which makes sense because the sublimation flux comes from the snow surface. But at the same time, you see that the isotopic composition is well below the 1-to-1 line. So this means the isotopic flux is depleted. So the sublimation flux is depleted in heavy isotopes. And therefore, we have directly observed isotopic fractionation during sublimation. So then with this, we of course have to ask ourselves, so what does this do to the snow isotopic composition? Because that's what we are interested in. And we then went to the lab and set up a laboratory experiment within controlled environmental conditions. And we put a lot of homogeneous snow samples with a homogeneous isotopic composition into this dry air chamber, where we circulated dry air to induce the sublimation process. And then every day we would take out one of these boxes, slice them up very thinly, and then analyze them for the isotopic composition. And the results of this experiment, you can see in this plot. So in the beginning, the snow sample has a homogeneous isotope profile. And then with every passing day, this profile changes and the snow surface gets enriched in heavy water molecules or heavy water isotopes. And therefore, this experiment basically showed us that the sublimation effect is that the snow surface gets enriched, but the signal also propagates further down into the snow. Now this, as I said, was in controlled lab experiments. And then, of course, we wanted to see if we can see the same effect in real conditions. So we went back to the Greenland ice sheet and took snow samples, a lot of snow samples. So here, basically, we took 10 snow samples per day and analyzed them as one sample. And this is one of these purple dots. So 10 samples per day to get rid of the spatial heterogeneity, basically. And you see that there's, throughout this summer period in 2019, between May and August, there's quite a lot of variability in this snow surface isotopic composition. And this does not only change during when times of snowfall, so when there's no new snow, but also in between snowfall events. And we also measured the vapor isotopic composition that you can see in blue. And you see that these two parameters, they co-vary quite a bit. And this is, of course, then hinting that there's an exchange going on between vapor and snow surface. And then the idea was to see if we understand what exactly is happening by simulating this variability in a way. But because we didn't want to parameterize any of the snowfall events, we stuck to the times without snowfall, and we wanted to model these day-to-day changes that we observed here. And I call them delta, basically. Okay, and in this very small, it's a small surface model, we then compared what we observed in this day-to-day change to the modeled day-to-day change. And this is what you're going to see here in a sec. So on the x-axis, you have the modeled day-to-day variability. And on the y-axis, the observed day-to-day variability of two field seasons, I need to say. It's 2018 and 2019. And first, we're going to look at the results from the model run without fractionation. And here you see that the model performs not very well. This is the one-to-one line. So yeah, the model doesn't capture the variability at all, basically. But then once we switch on isotopic fractionation during sublimation, the results, they fall much closer on the one-to-one line. And now if I have to give this a value, then we can say that this model, including fractionation, can explain 36% of the observed variability. And what you can also see in the model or in these results here is that on days where there's a higher net latent heat flux, so higher net sublimation, the changes that were observed but also modeled are higher, have a greater value. So there's more enrichment during these days. And what you also see is that the model, unfortunately, overestimates the enrichment quite a bit here, because they all fall to the right of the one-to-one line. Okay, but this was basically, with these results, we can then say that the vapor exchange actually has great potential to influence the top snow layer on daily timescales. But of course, for the ice core signal, it's more the seasonal or annual timescales that are of interest. And to answer whether vapor snow exchange is important for the seasonal or annual timescales, I have to say I will get back to you at some point and present you the latest results or future results. But for now, basically, I just want to point to this study that my colleague Laura Dietrich did. And she looked at this whole signal formation process in a more mass balance approach. Basically, when we talk about which process is the dominating process for the signal that we see in the ice core, we of course have to now evaluate precipitation versus sublimation. And like I said, she basically approached this question from a pure mass balance approach. And she took a regional climate model, a 30 years average for the ECScript location. And then she produced this curve here, which basically means that in summer, obviously sublimation is a summer process because you need the polar day conditions. That in summer, more than 30% of the snow of the mass that is brought in by snowfall is actually being sublimated. So there is a great potential for the vapor flux to actually change this summer isotopic composition. And of course, if a summer signal is changed, then this also has an influence on the annual signal. Okay, and with this, I think I'm already at the end of my overview talk here. And I just want to end with this slide from the beginning, where I want to say that we think, based on these results that I just showed you, that the surface processes are part of the transfer function between climate and ice core signal. And I also want to mention that if this is the case, then the ice core record is an even better climate archive than we have thought so far, because if you only record the climate signal during precipitation, you of course have a very biased record. Whereas if you have surface processes that happen continuously and imprint on the snow isotopic composition, the ice cores can be more of a continuous climate record, which would basically mean they are an even better archive. Okay, and here are just these 3 papers that I just presented. So yeah, in case you want to read them up. Okay, that's from my side.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia, for the very nice talk. Today we do it a bit differently than in the past, so that we have questions directly after the talk. So if anybody has questions, please just write them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
So was there any surface melt when you were out there?
No, we are on top of the ice sheet. Yeah, they have maybe, I mean, yes, in 2012, of course, they had a surface melt, and we maybe have one day or so when there is a tiny bit, but it's not something that we have to consider very much.
Okay.
I would also have a question to this last slide. And this is this, when you have like this in the ice core record, when you have a signal of precipitation and of surface processes at the same time, wouldn't it maybe also make the like you said, we have more information in there, but wouldn't it also maybe disturb each other? Or
well, so the signal that we are analyzing when we analyze an ice core is always just one signal, right? And we just need to decipher now where it comes from. But you're completely right that if this is a more complex than just the precipitation signal, that was basically what people have thought so far, then yeah, we need to see if this is the case for all seasons, or if this varies through time, if it's more important during the glacial or during the interglacial. So of course it makes things more complicated and not necessarily easier to interpret. Yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I mean, I can also, you know, like I will also stick around. So if people want to ask questions in the end, I can also ask.
Yeah. Okay, then
I just stop share.
Yes, and then Peter Washam, our next speaker, can put up his slides. And yeah, thank you, Sonia, again. And yeah, then exactly, we will do some brief questions directly after the talks, because some speakers were not sure if they can stay till the very end. And so we just do it this way, but then there's still time for questions at the end, or for more general discussions. And yeah, with this, we come to our next speaker, who is Peter Washam. And he is a research associate in the Department of Astronomy at the Cornell University. And there he works with Dr. Brittany Schmidt's, or in Dr. Brittany Schmidt's lab. And his research currently focuses on using underwater robotics to study ice-ocean interactions beneath Antarctic ice shelves, with ongoing projects beneath the Thwaites Eastern Ice Shelf and the Ross Ice Shelf. And yeah, with this, I give the word to Peter.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about some observations that were collected beneath the Ross Ice Shelf back in 2019, before the pandemic. Felt like an eternity ago, but yeah, so let's see if I can turn my little pointer on first. Let's do it, laser pointer. Okay, so below here is just a schematic of the underwater vehicle we use. It's called IceFin. Let me see if I can get rid of this little tab at the top. Maybe I can't. Oh well. Anyways, it's about 3 meters long and 25 centimeters across, and I'm sure many of you have heard about it, so I won't talk about it anymore. But the data we collected was within a crevasse, and what I'm showing here is the wall. Well, actually, I believe I'll show 2 of the walls of the crevasse. These are this is video footage from IceFin, and what you can see are these really neat features, morphological features in the ice. And this green fuzzy ice is now marine ice that's been accreted, whereas the white stuff below is just snowfall meteoric ice that's now melting at the time. And yeah, at the top of the crevasse, there's these really cool sort of like stalactites, I believe is the right term, of ice hanging down from the bottom. So pretty wild observations. Let's see. Right, so the study location is shown here on the map. It's this yellow star. It's at the back of the Ross Ice Shelf here, very close to the grounding line of the CAM ice stream. So the survey is shown in yellow here, and the grounding line at the sort of from remote sensing is shown there. So the site's really interesting because CAM ice stream is stagnant. It's not flowing. So the stuff downstream of that grounding line is just sort of creeping along as the rest of the ice shelf pulls it seaward. So it's kind of like frozen in time, if you will. Below, or sorry, on the right here is a map from IceFin of the ice, ocean, and seafloor that's collected over 3 dives. So the borehole's this white star right here. And then we drove about 1.5 kilometers beneath the ice. We mapped these 5 different crevasses, which were about 50 meters tall and 50 meters wide at their bottom, narrowing as you get up towards the top. And I'm going to focus mainly on this crevasse here, which is outlined in red, but then we also collected some data within this crevasse here. And critically, we collected these data as the tide was transitioning from like closer to spring conditions to closer to neap conditions. So on the left here are the 3 dives in blue overlaid on the CAT's 2008 tide model, which was shown to match well to the observations both of tidal elevation change on the surface with GPS and actually the mean predicted current speeds from the model and now the observations from IceFin. However, there's a good bit of range. So the mean are these sort of larger diamonds, and then the range from each dive are these smaller diamonds. So the final dive was sort of conducted around slack tide, at least the part when we were in the crevasse. So the predicted currents and the observed have a mean around 0 centimeters per second. But then again, there's this really interesting range that is unpredicted by a tide model. And just before I go any further, the first dive here was when we swam into that other crevasse. So now I'm showing the 3D ocean circulation in the crevasse. Now this is data collected with IceFin's ADCP, which was downward pointing. So we were collecting ocean current speeds. The data was incredibly messy, but I was able to pull out some signal. And so the V here is the north and south. So the purple is going into the page. That would be a southward flow through the crevasse, which you see very nicely here. And the orange would be coming out towards us to the north. The U would be left and right, so east and west. And then the W is simply up and down. So rising is this green data here, and then sinking is the purple. And so there's this really nice flow through the crevasse, which is this purple data here. At the time is going southward. And if you sort of integrate all that purple data right there over the area that you see, you get a flux of 5 cubic meters per second through the crevasse. But remember, this is pretty small feature. So it is, it's a significant flow. It's just constrained within this crevasse. And then on top of that, you see this overturning circulation with rising on the west side or the right side of the crevasse and sinking on the left side or east side of the crevasse. And these white lines now show the supercooling horizon on either side of the crevasse. And so the sinking's basically happening in this plume right underneath that supercooling horizon. And so you're getting brine rejection, densifying the water column, sinking. And before I go any further, these lines here, I'll get into them later. This is the vehicle track that's now been binned at 1 meter intervals, and I'll show the hydrographic data from that. And so if you turn those, if you take like an average of the water moving up and down on either side of the crevasse, they roughly balance one another. That's an area flux. If you convert that into a volume flux, basically you see that you're moving about 5 times the amount of water through the crevasse in this jet than you are sort of circulating up and down within the crevasse. And then again, there's just this weak lateral flow associated with the sinking plume as it sort of sweeps away from the wall. So now again, we're just looking at these data, these current speeds as vertical profiles in a compass plot. And on the west side, you see pretty much all the flow horizontally is to the south. There's some noise here, which is lined up on the picnic line. So that would have to do with internal waves most likely. And then you have a rising, pretty much sustained rising on that side of the crevasse. And then on the east side, these are now averages of the data on either side, either half of the crevasse. You see disorganized flow, basically no real signal except for in this sinking plume where we caught it with sort of a max downwelling of 2 centimeters a second, which is quite fast. And then a horizontal flow across of about 4 centimeters a second. Okay. So now what's interesting is that we have different circulation regimes within the crevasse at different depths. And we have all this imagery of the ice base or the ice walls. And we were able to sort of measure the scale of these features with a sonar on the front of the vehicle. And with all this data, you can start to say something about the drag, basically, that the ice is exerting on that flow. So first and foremost, you can see the west wall is shown here. This is now moving up the wall from sort of the keel to the roof, and then the east wall, again, we're moving upwards to the roof. And the features along pretty much once you rise above the keel of the crevasse, you have these ripple-like features, which are really interesting, so that they're asymmetric in that they have a long axis and a short axis. And actually, the short axis is oriented perpendicular to that through flow jet. And the short axis is somewhere between about 40 and 80 centimeters across. So that's what you see here. And each one of these features is somewhere between 10 and 30 centimeters deep. So that's the scale. As you move into the supercooled region, you kind of see these vertical runnels. And I'm calling these crystals here, I would not say they're actually ice crystals, but they're sort of a reflective surface. And it's definitely an accumulation of any sort of frozen ice that's sort of globbed together. And those are sort of a scale of 9 to 15 centimeters across. So way too big to be individual crystals. And below, you see a slightly different story on the other side of the crevasse. You now have scallops. So these are more symmetrical features. So this is consistent with the more randomized flow pattern until you get up to about sort of 490 meters, and then moving upwards from there towards the supercooled region. You have these awesome runnel features. So they're very vertical in orientation. And the maximum size of one of these is actually here. It's 2.5 meters across and 2 meters deep. So these are very, very deep features in comparison to the primarily horizontal ones. So this is all cool, but what we're after is a drag coefficient. So something we can use in our parameterization of melting, and ultimately something we can use to inform modelers who are interested in ice and ocean interactions. And the sort of takeaway here is that we get a range in drag coefficients of about 1 times 10 to the minus 3 to 1 times 10 to the minus 2. And the ocean modelers, ice ocean modelers would say, oh, great, we got it right already. But this is a very single specialized case, but it's a data point in an otherwise very sparse data set. So this is exciting. Moving forward, now we can look at the temperature and salinity throughout the water column, combine it with the current speeds, and sort of understand a little more what's happening in there. So the thermal driving is sort of the first order forcing of melting, ocean force melting, where the blue squares are the east side or the left side, and the red squares are the right side or west side. I hope I got that right. But the point is, when we collected the data, there was supercooling at the top of the crevasse. However, during springtide, which is shown sort of our prediction to the top, are these light red and blue lines. We don't predict that it would be supercooled to the top. So we took the dive in the crevasse at springtide and differenced it from the dive at neap tide over the depth range we got. And basically, it was warmer and saltier during springtide. So most likely you're melting all the way to the top of that crevasse during springtide. However, going back to neap tide, when most of the data was collected, you see this sort of wiggling and salinity, and n squared is basically a variable that tells us about how stratified the water column is. And you see there's instabilities here. There's water propagating up and down, which is consistent with the current speeds. So it's an unstable water column due to melting and freezing. In that jet that we saw on that lower western wall, we have the maximum concentration of glacial meltwater here, as well as the fastest current speeds. So this is sort of an interesting feature that's sort of pushing flow through the crevasse. And then finally, we can use this two equation approach from this paper right here and combine it with sort of this canonical 3 equation or 2 equation melt rate approach of this Holland and Jenkins paper to estimate melt rates and freezing rates throughout the crevasse. And now freezing F here is the combination of both frazzle production in the water column and direct freezing to the wall. And the takeaway here is that we have melt rates on the lower part of the crevasse, which are slightly higher on the west, where actually the wall is sloped next to that jet, which are up to about 60 centimeters a year, less than a meter a year during neap. And springtide, they're about a meter per year. And then freezing rates at the top that actually dominate the melting, or freezing rates during neap tide that dominate the springtide freezing. And this was all filled in with a model, basically a rising and sinking model, which I don't have time to explain. And so some key takeaways are shown in the schematic right here. You have this jet that's flowing through the crevasse at the time of sampling. We know that the morphological features in the ice wall next to it are orthogonal to that flow, which is cool. And we know that the width of this crevasse is too narrow for rotation to play a role on the circulation within it. So those features take about probably 3 months to form. So this is not a persistent, or sorry, it's not an ephemeral feature. This is what it's telling us. But from this, we can tell that's a persistent feature. And it's moving most of the water through the crevasse versus this overturning circulation. And so we have this pressure release dominating in some melting, but most of that meltwater is mixed away. So you have freezing at the top during neap tides, which outpaces melting during spring tides. And finally, yeah, that's sort of a summation of what's happening in this crevasse as far as we can tell from the observations. I'd like to acknowledge these co-authors and the drilling team from Antarctica, New Zealand that made this possible. And this paper will hopefully be submitted very, very soon for review. So thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Peter, for another very nice talk. And again, yeah, are there any immediate questions?
Maybe since we're sort of short on time, I can just hold any questions for the end.
Okay. Yeah, then let's just move forward to Shashwat Shukla. Okay, there will be a question at the end, if that's fine for you, Peter. Then let's move forward to Shashwat Shukla, and he is a PhD researcher in the Department of Geoscience and Remote Sensing at TU Delft in the Netherlands. And he is interested in exploring and understanding the firn processes of Antarctic ice shelves from space with a blend of radar remote sensing and microwave radiative transfer models. And with this,
can you look into my screen?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So from direct measurements in the Ross ice shelf, which was super interesting, let me take you to the space to see how these Antarctic ice shelves look. So to start with, Antarctica is a ticking time bomb of the Earth, where how big the explosion would be and how quickly it would explode are the big unknowns. From several spaceborne and airborne observations and in situ field campaigns, we have been informed that Antarctica is losing mass more rapidly in regions with weakened ice shelves. One of the examples is the rapid and dramatic collapse of Larsen B ice shelf in 2002. And one of the most potential culprits causing the ice shelf to weaken is the health of the firn. But how to monitor it? And is there a way? Well, one thing is that we can directly go to Antarctica and see the firn with our eyes, measure and analyze. But it is not practically possible always to be there at every point on Antarctica because it is labor intensive, then high cost of logistics and also harsh weather conditions. So as an alternative, we see that someone is observing right above us, above the sky in the space, and these are satellites, in particular radar. To make it not complicated, radars are like flying bats. Like bats, radar can also look through clouds and see in the dark. The only difference is that bats use ultrasounds while radar use microwaves. And these microwaves can penetrate into the ice sheet. More importantly, variation in the firn conditions, which are represented as here as roughness and firn properties, they can alter the signal and tell us the information what we are looking for. For instance, this presenting you this amazing masterpiece of Sentinel-1 SAR, capturing the collapse of Conger ice shelf in March 2022. Here, red color is a representative of regions where roughness dominates the satellite signal, whereas blue color specifically indicates the dominance of firn properties. In the open waters, the signal is majorly observed, which can be clearly seen over here. And in this, but however, due to the presence of sea ice, especially here and in this particular portion, we can see that the rough surface scattering processes are there, which indicates the type of the target, which in this case is rough sea ice. In the regions with yellowish tone, especially in this particular part, it identifies a mixed signal where the roughness and firn properties equally contribute. And we can see the spatial variability in the scattering processes as well. But an important question is, are we certain that these scattering processes represent reality? We will address this, but before that, let's learn what is the added value of looking into these firn scattering processes. Zooming in on the variability of firn scattering processes can further our knowledge on the changes of firn properties, because whatever we see in the changes of these scattering processes, they are an equal representation of how the firn properties are. Second is identifies and characterizing the regions where the roughness undermines the effect of firn properties on firn backscatter, which is a very crucial thing to look on if we are concerned about firn property retrieval from radar. And also, this can be used as one of the indicators for determining the health of the firn. For instance, observing the difference in the scattering behavior of the firn layer containing sufficient air with a depleted firn layer can help us to see how it can be used as to determine which particular part of the firn is healthy or unhealthy. Firn scattering processes, it sounds a bit complicated to extract, but how we will do that, let's see here. In this talk, I'll be more focusing on Sentinel-1 SAR, which is a C-band system with dual pole capability. Due to their polar orbits, Sentinel-1 satellites have a high image acquisition frequencies for Antarctica. Thus, Sentinel-1 provides an ideal ground coverage and imaging frequency for observing Antarctic firn. So basically, there are two types of products. One is SLC, which is single look complex, which contains both intensity and phase information. And thus, large scale computing here, it is a bit expensive and thus suited for the limited extent. But on the other hand, we have GRD data, which is ground range detected, which doesn't have any phase information and it has only intensity. This makes it a bit easy when it comes to implementation, especially continent-wide and large scale. So here we do it by using Google Earth Engine. But the next question arises in our mind is how and what we want to do exactly. Till now, it's all about theory, but what exactly we are looking for. So before starting it, usually there are a lot of well-established algorithms for SLC data. However, we can't apply these data on the GRD products simply because GRD doesn't have any phase information. This is the motivation of this work, where we apply a decomposition algorithm based on polarimetric indicators extracted from SAR data to make a continent-wide map of the type of firn scattering processes, thereby revealing their spatial variability and a link to the firn processes. As we in order to do that, we will focus on two main properties. First is entropy, and don't be a bit worried about these equations, but entropy here is determined simply by having a pseudo probability, which is extracted by a depolarization ratio, which is nothing but represented by Q. And here the entropy is between 0 and 1. So high entropy is nothing but it arises from the regions where randomly oriented particles are concentrated, whereas low entropy is the case where surface roughness comes into picture. So like entropy is nothing but the degree of randomness in the scattering pattern. And the second parameter is the scattering type, which is being recorded by this. So here, high scattering type value is nothing but it is representing the like depending on the in entropy, it is representing surface scattering or volume scattering or different types of scattering, which we'll be seeing in the next slides. So this is the general framework where we first prepare the data from Sentinel-1 GRD time series, and we try to filter according to metadata, temporal filtering, and spatial subset. And then we apply a mask, especially the two conditions which are a bit important. The first is the like sigma naught of copolarized wave shouldn't be greater than -20 dB, because when it is, then it means that the noise sigma tolerance of Sentinel-1 is reached, which is around -22 dB. And the second is second case condition is that this cross pole shouldn't be greater than a copole, because when this happens, then according to Cloud A condition, it is a bit unstable because of the SAR system. So after this valid mask, we convert this dB into linear, and then we apply a speckle filter in order to despeckle the data, followed by making a clustering algorithm, which is being done by having these two scattering descriptors, namely entropy and scattering type, and then we cluster, and that's how we get the result. But before entering in the result directly, let me explain a little bit about the clustering. So this is how we cluster all these firn scattering processes. So here the backscatter is decomposed into 6 zones representing pure scattering with low entropy, and then low to medium entropy, which is being generated by Z zone 2. And then it goes from pure to distributed to volume and to complex scattering. And this is how it is being represented. And this gray area is like the not feasible region, where if any pixel falls, then it doesn't correspond to what we are looking for. And in order to make more sense in terms of glaciological application, these particular descriptions correspond to a particular property which is dominant for that region. So low entropy pure scattering, which is zone 1, represents that the snow surface roughness, which is from medium rough to rough, is more dominant over that region. Whereas the zone 2, which is also a pure scattering, and it also corresponds to snow surface roughness, however, a different scale. Like here, it will be more smooth to medium rough. And zone 3 is more like a medium to high entropy. Here the entropy increases, which gives rise to a distributed scattering. And it represents that at those locations, surface snow density is more important than other properties. Whereas when we go for the high entropy case, here it will be more concerned about the randomly oriented snow grains, and more specifically microwave grain size. And then it comes to volume scattering, which arises from the firn, and complex scattering. Complex scatterings are basically the mixed signal, which are a bit hard to interpret in terms of like how we want to see it. Like if we are just looking at the classified map, then we can say that here it is a combination of both snow surface roughness and firn properties. But when it comes to firn property retrieval, then I think this area should be disregarded because of the mixed response. But before starting that, then like where we are looking at these at this talk. So the first area is drowning modelland. The second is a Shackleton ice shelf. The third is Ross ice shelf, and the fourth is Pine Island and Thwaites Glacier. So let's proceed for drowning modelland. So here is the two images which you see. The first image here is the ratio, which is a simple depolarization ratio which we get from Sentinel-1. And here it simply corresponds that the low value of this ratio is the region which is more dominated by the roughness, and the high value of the ratio is, especially in this parts, it corresponds to the areas which are more dominated by firn properties. So this is a general classification between these in this image. However, it is a very difficult task to separate the firn volume and the roughness and different types of things. So that's what we see from this classified image, where there are like zone 1 to zone 6, what I represented before. And in general, what we see that in the ice shelf area, especially here, the cyan color represents the area which is dominated by firn volume scattering, where the firn properties are more dominant. And when it comes to the ice rises, specifically, this is ham ice rise. And here we can see that in the middle of in the tip of the ice rise, snow surface density seems more important. It simply relates it to the accumulation event, where the accumulation is a bit more than the other than the more ice shelf region. And when it comes to this particular portion, which is the blue ice field, then it shows a very like low entropy case, which is supposed to be, as we see from our classification, that roughness is more dominating in this. But let's have a more zoomed in version of this particular blue ice area. So this figure, I really found it super interesting because of the variation what we can see from this classified image. So here, especially in this particular part where there's a light red color, here you can see that it is it is a pure, like, roughness is more dominating, and especially the roughness over in this particular region is from medium to large scale roughness. Whereas in this particular region, which is a bit darker tone, here the roughness changes to a more smaller, like smooth to medium roughness. So it clearly indicates that there is a localized change in the roughness, which we can't look from the satellite, from the SAR image directly, even if we have different polarizations. And when it comes to this green color region, which is a Z3, and it is like dominated by the snows, like the snow particles, which are low density snow layers, which is accumulated over the blue ice region. And these particular part represent that the top surface snow density is more important. So this is more interesting because here we can also look into where exactly the snow accumulation over the very thin layer of snow low density snow is being there, and where it is positioned within the ice, within the blue ice region. So yeah. Now, when it comes to Shackleton ice shelves, so this is the image of the depolarization ratio again, where, as I told before, that low represents more dominated by rough, and the high represents more dominated by firn. So this is the Bowman Island, this is the Wills Island, and this is the part of the Shackleton ice shelf. So what we see in this classified image is that especially a part of the Shackleton ice shelf is being very much influenced by the roughness. And also we can see that there are different type of roughness, like mediums to rough and smooth to medium. And moreover, like the low density snow layer has been located in several small subregions like here. And these subregions are nothing but the location where snow surface density is more important. And in some part of the area where the firn density is playing, like the firn properties are playing a role, and you are getting a very volume scattering response. And yes, so this is about the Shackleton ice shelf. And when it comes to Ross ice shelf, here also we see a similar trend what we saw before, that snow surface density is very much more important than roughness. It means that the accumulation over in this particular surface is more. However, we also see this type of scattering which is coming from the rough surface, indicating the crevasses which are present over there. And this particular pink color surrounding the ice shelf is nothing but the boundary of the ice shelf, which is being represented by like a proper surface scatterer and a rough, like a proper rough sea ice mainly. And when it comes to the last Pine Island and Thwaites Glacier, so here it's very interesting to note that particularly in this section, in this particular section, there are a lot of scattering features which are arising from a rough surface feature. And there are a lot of channels which are nothing but highly crevassed areas and open fracture, which are being represented in this clearly. And this can be like shown in, if if searched in more detail, then it can be a very good way and a complementary information to the analysis, where we see that how damage accelerate the ice shelf instability. And so, yes, so this is about it. So the main takeaway home messages from here is that large spatial variability is observed in firn scattering processes across Antarctic ice shelves. And like it is mainly used to identify and characterize the regions which are dominated by roughness and firn properties. And also we can use this information for having a like more detailed analysis when it comes to understanding the ice shelf instability and also the health of the firn. And finally, it provides a new perspective of Antarctic ice shelf from Sentinel-1 SAR, which was not seen before. So it's pretty exciting. And it opens a lot of research avenues and research opportunities in the future. First is looking at the temporal variation. Since now I've just showed you the spatial variation, but if we look into the temporal variation and how each class and each class of this algorithm is changing with time and how it is like replicating to the reality, it would be very interesting to find out. And second is in the retrieval of firn properties, because since, as I told you, from this direct SAR image, it is very difficult to separate the firn properties volume, firn volume effect, and also the roughness effect. So this kind of gives an idea, like a pre-idea that which zones are more dominated by roughness and which are more dominated by firn properties. And it could be a very interesting use case for blue ice regions. And also multiple microwave frequencies can be made in use so that it can provide a very robust estimation and characterization. And also, like, since here there are different classes, so these are discrete classes. So in the future, a continuous variable can be derived from this so that this discretization can be rid of. And we can also look into a more like a continuous change. And finally, the evaluation with in situ and model firn and climate data could be a very big advantage. For example, comparing this particular regions and these classes with different type of properties, what we have like surface melt, density, or wind speed. So it could be a very interesting thought. And this is it. I also have the full map of this particular part in the appendix slide. But yeah, if I think my time is already up. So if you are interested, then I can show you. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Shashwat, for your talk as well.
Yeah.
And now we come to the final questions.
Can I ask Peter a question?
Yes, go for it.
I was interested in the implications for sort of stability of the ice, the mechanical stability of the ice, of changing the shape of the crevasse. And I wondered firstly, whether you thought that this kind of circulation was common in different places, and just whether you had thoughts about the mechanical stability and the implications for that from the morphology changes that were happening.
Yeah, so for instance, this crevasse, if you do a back of the envelope thing, it's something like 150 years. So you melt away and reach the supercooling horizon. That's sort of the melt rate on the bottom of the ice, so outside the crevasse. And then it would widen during that time. But I don't think there's good reason to expect the supercooled region to ever melt away. Well, eventually it would take a long time and have to move to a different circulation regime. But we also collected data in a crevasse beneath Thwaites, and we did not go to the top of that crevasse, but we got sort of that base 5 meters or so in the crevasse, and you have a similar through flow jet within that feature. And now that crevasse is approximately 3 times the width of this one. And there's a bunch of them there too. So if you're in a warm cavity environment, I think, and you have one of these ice shelves that's in sort of a broad embayment, I think you can move a good deal of water through these features and then they can melt out. And then there's the interplay with stratification and melt reduction in warm cavities, which would serve to suppress melting on the bases and allow melting laterally. And there's a paper from 2015 by Bassis and Ma, I think, that talks about this sensitivity factor of crevasse melting. So if it's greater than 1, then the crevasses tend to destabilize the ice shelf. I'm not a glaciologist, so I can't tell you if they got it right or wrong, but that's out there in the literature at least.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question to Sonia. Yeah, so Paco, please. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Okay, all three talks were really excellent, but I particularly enjoyed that of Sonia in the sense that so she did such a beautiful presentation of, for instance, the water fractionation and so on. It was so well structured as scientific method, that I would say. So I really enjoyed all three, but this particular one. And I have a quite general question related to your work, and is that I'm curious to know which is the time resolution of this ice core record, because you have been doing things with daily resolution, with yearly resolution, but I guess that for the ice core records the resolution is much is different. Of course, the time scale is probably different. So what is actually I'm not expert in the ice coring, so I don't actually know which is the time resolution for the usual, for instance, for the temperature record from this delta O.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and also the previous stuff. So the ice core, as you said, of course, it's basically you can resolve seasonal and annual stuff in the upper 100 meters or so, right? And then you have with the densification and then also the thinning of the individual annual layers, it becomes like the individual layers become thinner and thinner, and at the very bottom you basically have like hundreds of years in centimeter scales, right? So of course then it gets much more complicated, but basically I think it's important to do it from the other end, right? I mean, to understand what is the impact of these surface processes on the annual scale, and then we of course also have to ask ourselves whether if we can then identify, well, it might be because you need a certain net sublimation, so it actually has an effect on the annual signal. Then you can maybe screen whether the glacial and interglacial have different sublimation regimes, whether the meteorological conditions were just completely different, or whether also this is spatially on the Greenland and maybe also Antarctic ice shield different. So then yeah, it might be that we can say, well, for the glacial it doesn't there is no contribution from surface fluxes, but for the interstitials it is. So that's a bit the question that, yeah, there's many more follow-up questions for sure, but this is more like the stage of my research was more like, is this a process that we have to take into account or not? And currently it looks like, at least for the summer signal, it looks like we have to, maybe.
Okay, perfect explanation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? Otherwise, I would have a question for Shashwat. So if I understood you correctly, you said that firn properties only in some regions kind of have a big impact on the remote sensing data. So does it mean we also can only infer firn properties in these areas, or are there maybe some different type of sensors or other ways to infer firn properties all over the ice sheet?
No, exactly, because since we are looking at C-band, so C-band has a bit lesser penetration than L-band. So maybe like for inferring the firn properties, L-band would be the best suited because it has like more more concentration from the firn properties as compared to C-band, because C-band also has a major influence from the top surface, like a major return. So yeah, so I think there will be more sensor if we are looking at, especially if we want to look at the top surface, then we can look at X or C band. And if you're looking for the firn properties, then L band would be more suited.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, any last questions? Otherwise, when looking at the time, I would close the meeting for today, and again want to thank our 3 great speakers. And with this, I wish you goodbye and see you next week. Oh, Tavi, do you have a slide for the next week's speaker already?
You're right, I haven't. I've failed there. So yeah, the next talk is I'm not even sure if I have that immediately to hand. Yeah, sorry, I failed there. It's on the emails that everyone's been sent. Don't have that instantly.
Okay, if I see it correct, it should be a CS, or it should be sea ice talks,
yeah,
which we also have
correct.
new in this season. And there are 2 talks by Walter Meyer and Alan Buckley, and they're about a review of the 2022 Arctic sea ice season and summer Arctic sea ice melt from altimetry. And I think we would post the slide somewhere on social media. And yeah, with this, again, I want to thank you all for your attention and the speakers again for presenting today, and wish you goodbye.
Thank you very much, Falk. That was great. Thank you to all the speakers as well.
Bye.